How can one characterize the right wing? For the left, the traditionalists, specifically the Christian traditionalists in the West, and the Manosphere are both parts of the right. However, traditionalists and Manosphere, while agreeing on many points, disagree on the very core basis of philosophy, and that difference is very much grounded in the position, nature, and importance of the woman. There are three major ways in which traditionalists view things differently than part of the manosphere. As this piece is a critique of the traditionalist viewpoint, let us look at the differences with respect to how the manosphere sees the world around it. Firstly, traditionalists view the reality as different. Traditionalists believe in the Nawalt principle. Not all women are like this, as much as it applies to the left, applies to traditionalists. Traditionalists refuse to quote any discussion about the nature of woman unless that discussion either uplifts the woman or strengthens the traditionalist viewpoint, or presents women as helpless victims or children who need to be protected and taken care of. Further, traditionalists believe that large swaths of society are traditional, and a state of alarm by the manosphere is a projection of their own bitterness, insecurity, and lack of virtue. Traditionalists do not disagree that there are problems in the society. However, traditionalists refuse to believe that women are the cause of this, for many reasons, two of which are because they want to hold men and women equally bad, and secondly, women less responsible. Unless traditionalists hold that, they cannot argue for traditionalist society, which is based on equality of two genders in eyes of God and presentation of women as beings to be protected. Because women are to be viewed as helpless damsels in distress, traditionalists do not believe that men are systematically harmed by women. They believe it is because of either some elite nefarious system that brainwashed women or just the fallen nature of human beings. Some religious group brainwashed women into the sexual revolution. Corporations brainwashed women into entering the workforce. Some population lowering and West and White's genocide conspirators brainwashed women into abortion. In defense of each point, traditionalists use the feminist tactic of pointing out cases where advocating for any of the so-called pro-women policies actually harmed the woman. Of course, amid tens of thousands of women making money from sexual liberties, we could find ones that have had bad experiences and where they were taken advantage of by males. The set standard of traditionalists is, however, clear. Unless women benefited absolutely from a stance, its responsibility cannot be put on women. No wonder, therefore, the traditionalists kept themselves hidden when feminism was rife, only uncovering themselves after the liberals and manosphere had criticized feminism and women. Once feminism died down popularly on the internet, traditionalists came out of hiding to reclaim themselves as kings of the hard work done by others. The virtuous Christians under the aegis of God, who were escaping the wrath of sluts and whores, came out to bash the Kumars and the PUAs. Why? Because even if traditionalists were brave, they just did not want to criticize women. And to criticize feminism effectively, they needed to criticize women. This brings us to the second major difference between the two views, that is, of traditionalists and manosphere. Traditionalists believe in interpreting history a little differently. History is not viewed through the simple lens of arguments being made and the groups making them, but it is viewed in a roundabout way. If you view history simply, a chain of thought emerges, which even the feminists accept. As wealth in society increased, women became more important. Women sought power first, then financial independence, then sexual liberty to gain maximum benefit of their sexual prowess, and then tackled social prejudice against women. Everyone accepts this view, but not the traditionalists. Their view of history is that weak men and lack of spiritual and religious character took society to destruction. Everything else is incidental. That is all. Such a view is adopted because traditionalists see society in terms of an ideal position and deviation from it, not as advancements one after another in sense of ideas developing from basic nature of the participants engaged in those ideas. The version of history does not view history in terms of a unique chain of ideas, but in sense of deterioration brought about because of separation from God. The view works in the sense that it allows traditionalists to not perceive to address the society as it is, but perceive it from the point of view of a future goal. So it is an easy way to survive until traditionalists become dominant again. But how will traditionalists become dominant again? Here the third point comes into the picture. Traditionalists have a love-hate relationship with the manosphere. In one sense, traditionalists realize that men are the natural allies, and any male group that is into serious political and social analyses and is not left-wing is very likely to be very similar to them. Traditionalists also realize that women are not natural allies of the right. And yet still women are way more valuable than men for the traditionalists because their own viewpoint is less important than the society, which of course can only be formed by the valuation of women as much more important than men. The divide of intellect and emotions is a necessary cornerstone of religious traditionalism. And for this reason, traditionalists seek to only point out any intellectual inquiry into the nature of sex through emotional means, often putting every factual observation into the garment of virtue and morality to distract from the underlying thesis, whilst maintaining its potency, even if reduced to some effect. In such a sense, traditionalism seeks to borrow things from more red-pilled traditions and appropriate it to the end of societal benefit. All non-left-wing males are fallen allies of themselves, and women are a natural end to male-female dynamics. This is why it was not a surprise that feminists gained a lot of momentum by bashing the so-called unruly males, which allowed them to effectively work with traditionalists to punish males living in the fringes of society. Of course, as sex is intoxicating, so is empathy towards women, and any sort of moderation appealed by traditionalists does not remove the intoxicant, but only makes it of a longer and more sustainable duration, hence allowing women a free run to exploit the system. This is why it is such that the roads of manosphere and traditionalists do not cross. They remain forever separated. And while it is no doubt that only few males would choose manosphere, because as manosphere increases, the value of leftover males for females would increase as well, it is worth wondering whether the success of traditionalism is dependent on they themselves or just capturing the coalition of many men and almost all women in a sense of exchange that occurs when women realize their folly. Of course, the forgiveness swiftly follows for women. The tradition waits just for that moment to include the lost prodigal daughters back into the group as the focus shifts from feminism to common enemies of the traditional men and the women on both sides of the spectrum. Let us listen to religious traditionalist critique of the manosphere from a religious traditionalist. It could be divided into 4 parts, a prologue, and then a short discussion about 3 splinter groups in the manosphere: pickup artists, men rights activists, and MGTOWs.
Do you see the Manosphere Red Pill as a potential political ally against progressivism, harnessing male sexual energy into a practical political movement? Well, I mean, I hate to say it, but I really... kind of yes and no. The manosphere is fine if you want to move from the manosphere to a reactionary political movement. But the problem is it's so fundamentally broken. The difficulty is, A, it tends to attract more broken people, and that's fine. You know, I get it. It tends to attract more broken people. B, its aesthetics are horrible.
Right off the bat, we arrive at something that is very interesting. It could be assumed as a fact that manosphere does attract broken people. It is a movement explicitly against biological impulses, so it must carry with itself the burden of men being burnt, or seeing others burn, or being afraid of burns they may receive in future. But this wild goose chase of aesthetics and not broken people, essentially the good and the beautiful, from the often quoted search for the true, the good, and the beautiful, is perhaps the most hilarious self-owning critique. It is quite clear that from popular perception, the most stringent enemies of the religious traditionalists were not only very pro-aesthetic people, but also well settled. In fact, the whole critique of elites, aka top-class people in traditionalist circles, along with creative artists involved in pushing the envelope of degeneracy, seems rather dumbstruck. Of course, traditionalists would like to believe that such people are themselves broken and just degenerate. But even if such is the case, these people clearly are not perceived by the masses as such, and that is all that matters. A consequentialist argument is only as good as the effect it secures.
The Manosphere are comprised of three groups, each with their own terrible problems. The first one are the pickup artists. Second people are the men's rights activists. And the third people are the MGTOW. Okay, let's start in that order. Pickup artists, by their very nature, are essentially trying to exploit a system rather than fix its problems. I guess in some sense, because they're so obviously cynical, they're therefore sometimes the easiest to reach. And Roosh would be a good example of this. But I'm sorry, before you explicitly stop exploiting the problem and start trying to actually fix the problem, you're essentially just being a grifter, right? I mean, that's it. I mean, maybe you don't reap your grift in terms of monetary reward. Maybe you reap your grift in terms of sexual conquests, but you're essentially just doing a vash, and you're essentially just trying to exploit the situation of people being depressed and on the fritz rather than actually trying to do something about it collectively. And our problem has origins that are collective and spiritual. They don't have the problems that we're facing in the sexual dynamic are not that there aren't enough Lotharios out there trying to exploit the situation. And if there aren't enough native Lotharios trying to exploit the situation, I'm sure that we'll be able to import enough Lotharios from the third world to fill that quota. So I'm pretty sure that's not an actual solution. So, okay, cynical grifters, probably not going to be a source of energy without repentance, but maybe repentance is possible.
Moving on further and listening the take about PUAs, it just seems absurd. PUAs are what they are. There is no hidden agenda of PUAs as a whole. The agenda is clear from the name itself. Calling out PUAs for exploiting the system or being grifters also seems to be bizarre because neither of the terms is applicable here. The system is designed where the sex is exchanged for resources, and there is a way to limit how much is exchanged. There is no magical system aside from that. PUAs are not grifters as a whole, but some of them are maybe. PUAs as a whole would be grifters if they were promising something aside from what they say in every video, which is basically understanding female nature and reducing costs of getting laid. Now, whether their method works or not, or whether they overrepresent its success, is another question. But then they are either knave or just scammers, not grifters. Holding PUAs responsible for not fixing the system is like holding a person who sells cheap imitated art responsible for not promoting the real costly paintings. PUAs are not responsible for the mess people are in. They are just hustlers. The problem is created by liberals who want to liberalize sex, and traditionalists who want to keep the price of sex high, to force a commitment from men. But that is not all. The other point of criticism is that PUAs promote Lotharios, that is, men who pursue sex selfishly. Traditionalists dislike such men because such men prevent a high price of sex, preventing traditionalists from using mere sexual impulses to essentially run society. It is like a posh restaurant selling burgers being upset at a hustler selling burgers on a food cart at a much cheaper cost. The difference is that in this case, the people aggrieved are not even store owners, but just free store bouncers for the woman. Of course, the good old religious repentance would save the day and make these hustlers realize that sex is like a stock on the NYSE, whose price must be raised artificially so others can check out with huge balances. We see then an admission in regards to MRAs.
Let's go on to the men's rights activists. And I have somebody who does admire Karen Strawn in a lot of ways. She was one of the first YouTube red pillars out there, and she made great video essays. And she spoke very, very frankly in a way that was very, very hard for the left to confront. No judgment there whatsoever. What's the big problem? Well, it's more or less the same problem as the Constitution conservatives. There's no point in invoking a right against the issuer of that right. It's even worse than Constitution because at least the Constitution was a set of rights that was granted to the American people at some point in the past, ostensibly by the same political body that wants obedience from us in the present year. So presumably, under classical Christian notions of rule by law, there should be some kind of relationship there, right? Of course, that Christian rule of law is abrogated by a nation that's no longer Christian. That being said, I can forgive that. Men's rights activists are unfortunately, their delusions even further. Their delusion on rights goes to the sort of the UN Charter on rights. Here you're trying to, actually it's worse than the UN Charter of Rights. UN Charter of Rights are a statement of rights against a political body that was never sovereign to begin with. Men's rights activists are trying to create rights without even a sovereign entity that has ever guaranteed these rights or could possibly guarantee these rights into the future. It's petitioners without any hope of a petition being answered. It's people coming and pleading at the throne of a power structure that thrives off of that specific group's disenfranchisement. The only route for men's rights activists is to realize that trying to claim rights against a system whose political formula functions on denying your rights is pretty much ridiculous to begin with and should never be pursued. The other problem with men's rights activists is men's rights activists, even if we were to grant that they could invoke rights to get their way out of men's problems, if we were just simply to go in and reform the divorce laws and make men and women's shelters more equitable and reform feminism from the ground up in the way that people like Karen Strong might want, we still wouldn't have confronted a lot of the pathological sexual dynamics that entered in under the sexual revolution. There was a time after the sexual revolution and before feminism. That time was the early 1960s. That was a horrible time to be a woman, in my opinion, because you were essentially exploited. The solution, if we grant men's the problem that needs fixing is the fact that men and women have no equitable and trust-based way of interacting with each other. It's not that one sex doesn't have rights. If your husband can divorce you at 30, with minimal amount of alimony and no support, and you have 3 kids and you can't get a new husband and you're a divorcee and that doesn't mean anything, and we're in a culture that isn't set up for that. That's not a comfortable situation to be in as a woman. And a lot of women found themselves in that situation in the early 1960s. If the bonds of marriage, if that promise can be broken, if that sacramental bond can be broken, I'm not sure that any right that man asks for against the state is something that's ever going to be respected. Certainly not any kind of rights as men or women can be respected. So the only path for the men's rights activists is to quickly realize that rights are stupid and useless unless some kind of healthy dynamic between the sexes is formed in terms of some kind of relationship form that benefits both of them in a long-term capacity. And also whether we have some kind of collective spiritual dynamic that can actually inspire some sovereign entity to make promises and keep those promises. And what forces a sovereign entity to keep those promises cannot be a previous promise made by said sovereign entity. If I haven't said that enough, a promise made by a sovereign entity cannot be the force that strikes fear into the sovereign entity itself. That runs into the classic problem of who watches the watchers. It has to be some higher and deeper motivating force, something moral, aesthetic, or spiritual.
The political structure thrives from their disenfranchisement. But then the distributist quickly goes into the other side of the equation because he has to defend the woman's cause. It is of course because men and women are equal in eyes of God. He has to point out a time before feminism and after sexual revolution. Apparently, the distributist does not consider the first wave of feminism as feminism, where women were essentially exploited. It is funny because it confirms the point that I have argued for earlier. Feminism is an extension of traditionalism. A neo-reactionary thinks that in early 1960s, women were being exploited. essentially the same argument that feminists make. The distributist then justifies alimony, child support, and presents a state of burden for women with children, which are exactly the points that feminists used to grant the rights of abortion and for unleashing family courts to destroy many men. Can we really believe that the traditionalists did not play a role in aiding feminists to punish unruly men, when here in 2020 hindsight, traditionalists are still getting emotional about it? Can we really trust them again? Of course, traditionalism here appears to be just God-anointed feminism. But let us try to understand the situation. Which groups prominently asked for sexual revolution? Was it not liberals, comprising of both men and women? So a gender-neutral group and women. In fact, women asked for sexual revolution whining against males. When they got it, and males adapted to that situation, the traditionalists plastered women's wounds by acting against the men, which allowed women to pass even worse laws. How come women, if they were being exploited in the 60s, immediately got into a position in which they got the sole authority to kill their babies in the 70s, and eventually did not even need to inform their husbands before doing so, for example in the USA? Why didn't exploiters do anything about it? It's the same old story that mirrors the rape culture argument that feminists give. Apparently, rapists and harassers have so much power in the world and over women, even though mobs arise in a split second when a woman is being harassed to protect her, and a powerful judge is dragged to the court over unbelievably low evidenced accusations and made a show of. Society grievously punished the exploiters of the woman, but we still have to believe that the exploiters were so powerful. Seeing a Marxist analysis here is rather amusing but not surprising. But is it even true? A study titled No Fault Divorce Legislation and Its Impact on State Divorce Rates by seemingly a woman, Elizabeth N. Massey, in 1981 shows a different picture. Measuring the impact of the sexual revolution, the study finds that divorce score index developed by the author is explained by the rate of unemployment to a great degree. In the 1960s, whose unemployment is it likely to be? Also, is it the unemployed males divorcing women because they found a high maintenance beauty, or is it because of plain old hypergamy? Of course, in chaos, both men and women would change strategies to try to maximize their benefits. But even though sexual revolution was pushed by females, and women were also divorcing or cheating on their husbands, and men were showing the proverbial middle finger to traditional mores, traditionalists still helped create a society which legalized abortion in all states of the US by constantly whining about female victims of male exploiters. A great self-own. The problem is not that MRAs are wrong in fighting for men's rights. The problem is neither the left nor the traditionalists want MRAs to get those rights, because their hearts go out to even a single victim that has a vagina of such laws. But not obviously about the countless male victims of the opposite laws, because traditionalists want to keep women with them for babies and for God. But the greatest icing on the cake is yet to arrive. The distributist then discusses MGTOWs.
I'm really taking a digression here. MGTOW. I mean, this is kind of the most problematic community. In some sense, there's the least things wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with going your own way. And in some sense, they realized one of the core elements of relationships between men and women. In order for men to be desirable to women, they cannot have their lives revolve around women. In order to pursue something, you need to hold it lightly, and you need to be able to walk away from sex, even if you want to pursue sex in a correct way. If you look at Old Testaments of manliness, be they either the Christian code of Bushido or the Buddhist code of Bushido, that sounded weird. The Buddhist code of Bushido sounded weird. Or even something as old as the Epic of Gilgamesh. Everywhere you will see core to male ethics is an ability to control their sexual appetite and an ability to walk away from it at any time. In some sense, MGTOW is the most based of all of these manosphere philosophies. In reality, though, in practice, it's the worst one. By far. Because in practice, I don't know how they've done it. MGTOW has not created... I mean, if MGTOW was being done correctly, it would have created a whole class of ascetic monks, of men that are totally independent minded, who never think about sex and are only focused on creating great things. Hey, maybe it's only being really good at StarCraft or painting a Warhammer army if you're inclined to do that. Or maybe it's writing the great American novel. Or maybe it's prayer or physical fitness or any one of these inclinations. For the most part, people like Stardust, notwithstanding, obviously, who's a genuinely deep soul. But for the most part, the MGTOW community, as you experience them online and in the comment section, is not a bunch of monks or a bunch of heroic ascetics taking control of their own desires, either to pursue them or to deny them absolutely. It's a bunch of bitter people who have eschewed dating real women so that they can masturbate to fake women online, and who are so subsequently enthralled to these sexual fantasies that it has kept them perpetually in a state of bitterness, to the point where they come on to every single other person's channel and constantly comment on how their own endeavors are going to fail. 4 years ago, in 2016, the first year my channel started, I made a video about Turd Flinging Monkey and MGTOW. Every day, or every other day, I still get a comment on that video by upset MGTOW telling me about how I'm going to get raped by the divorce courts. Well, maybe I'll regret starting a family at some point, but it's been 4 years and that hasn't happened. And the fact that these people are digging up 4-year-old videos with how biased the YouTube algorithm already is should tell you something about the mentality of these people. MGTOW is not actually delivering on the promise of men going in their own way, and for that reason I have very little hope in it.
The Distributist then commends MGTOWs for realizing that in order to be valued by women, men should not have their lives revolve around women. It is kind of funny because he frames it to make it appear that this is something that MGTOWs took from traditions, as he cites several male codes of conduct. But clearly, if that were the case, why did not we see traditionalists forcing that point in the 50s and 60s and 70s? Because it is the MGTOWs who popularized the principle as a fact in recent history. The answer is simple. There is a corollary to the principle, and traditionalists are either ignorant or do not want to discuss that. The reason why women do not find men whose lives revolve around them to be desirable is because such men would be less able to earn and provide them comforts. They need men tame enough so that they can control them, but wild enough to dominate the world, to bring the green cash to them. But saying it like this destroys the traditionalist narrative of emotions and virtue, so they censor this part. What men are told is just that they need to reject sex, but of course not completely, because both the society and God need babies. Men have to be lustful and kept lustful, so much so that they share half of their property for getting laid. But they must also be able to walk away from sex at any time. In any other situation, a system with such demands would be considered sociopathic. But of course, in the name of virtue and morality, it is all acceptable. The classical deception of pursuing sex by not pursuing it is the exact same thing liberal sexual values are based on. It is also funny that the Distributist talks about Epic of Gilgamesh, talking about the male code of ethics. Epic of Gilgamesh does talk about it, but that is not its most important theme. Its most important theme is exactly the opposite of the traditionalist narrative. The same wild Enkidu that Gilgamesh lures using a temple prostitute is the one who disrespects even the goddess of sex for his friend, after which he is killed by the gods. The story does show men resisting desire of sex, but more importantly, it shows the perils of civilizational view of sex. As a pure-hearted Enkidu, who is lured by Gilgamesh, dies for his friend by actions of none other than the lustful goddess of sex. Then the Distributist misunderstands what based means. When people say based to comment or observation or an explanation, they do not know who the person making the comment usually is. It does not matter whether that person is a degenerate, a criminal, or even Satan himself. What matters is whether the thought itself is based on a solid foundation of reason and observation and a strong and enduring philosophy. That is where it ends. One must ask here for want of thoughtful pondering. How many virtuous NPCs can be actually called based? Then the traditionalists show a misunderstanding of MGTOWs, sex and monkhood. Sex is an involuntary feeling. It arises spontaneously. People can choose to suppress it when it arises, but sexual desires magically do not vanish. Clearly, the traditionalists are also woefully unaware of monkhood. If there was ever a monk who could reach a level where he just never thought of sex, he would not be spending his time playing StarCraft or painting a Warhammer army. Monks leave all desires behind. This shows how religious traditionalists are completely aloof of how anything related to ascetic penance works. Another point I frequently make: the ways are just separate. Somehow traditionalists believe that sexual desire, which is the desire to which all our senses are geared, because of nature's prime urgency in wanting us to reproduce, would be defeated earlier than the desire to play with plastic figurines or pixels on the screen. The distributist also does not understand what MGTOW is. MGTOW is not about being Jesus. Surprising that for largely being Christians who believe that all men are fallible, the new reactionary crowd also believes that MGTOWs would reach a level where Matthew 5:28 would fail to apply to them. I wonder what magic would reverse millions of years of the evolutionary process. But of course, Dave's point is more rhetorical. How do they fare in it might be an interesting question, but regardless, the main defining point of MGTOWs is that they analyze male-female relations and the contemporary society with the aim of suggesting men that they realize that self-autonomy is the desired goal for men, and many principles that men follow willingly are based on lies. Those areas are places where men could function in a way that is easy and can bring a change in their lives, for better or worse. But none of that is about virtue per se. Then the distributist calls MGTOWs bitter. I would mostly agree. That is what the red pill should do. Traditionalists' criticism of MGTOW is same as the feminists' criticism of MGTOW. It is that these people are better. They just do not get along with others. They are upset at some things which they believe to be fundamentally flawed. If you see the fragility of the world, you must enter into a state of bitterness. You would not if you never put the world away with your intellect. Traditionalists do not want to enter into that zone. They want to be happy. We've already chosen which pill to take in this regard. Fair enough, but then complaining about these people hounding others in chats is rather amusing. Maybe the more reasonable explanation for the distributist's observation of MGTOWs leaving comments to a 4-year-old video of his with Turd Flinging Monkey about MGTOW is that Turd Flinging Monkey is a popular MGTOW content creator. And this debate or discussion, whatever you call it, is posted perhaps as a link in repositories in areas where MGTOWs frequent. And eventually MGTOWs click on it and find their way as they are searching for MGTOW content still available on YouTube. The distributist's complaint is also bizarre because the situation is not even that bad. The dislike to like ratio is around 0.069, which is very low for such a controversial topic. There are around 90 comments for around 2700 views, which is reasonable for an intellectual video. Comments by MGTOWs are not just small or copy-pasted, but many are specific and conversationalist, and some are analytical and of moderate size. Because the issue is still alive, of course the distributist would still get comments, and mostly the MGTOWs would criticize him because they are, well, MGTOWs, and he is arguing against their position in the video. The argument that MGTOWs distribute black pill is also surprising because religious traditionalists themselves talk about just surviving, do not have any direct plan, do not even know how their ideal world would look like, and have no idea to bring any effective change. Of course, it is quite possible that one day traditionalists will win because they will just outlive other groups, but that is as much of a victory as saying life finds a way. It is meaningless. Different groups gain and lose power all the time. Also, no, he does not get a comment on that video every other day. He gets around one or so every week, and only a few of them are by MGTOWs. But the statement was clearly intended as a hyperbole, so no worries. Also, the distributist's argument about MGTOWs saying that he will get divorce raped is interesting. Statistics show that 30% to 40% of couples in the USA will divorce. MGTOWs use these stats often, so clearly they do not believe that every marriage fails. Often it is just a straw man from the side of traditionalists. It appears what MGTOWs mean is that the distributist would realize he is wrong when he faces the consequences, because apparently seeing a 30% to 40% rate, he is still unflinched. No sane person would take chances with probabilities like that, according to them. But such is the power of pussy. Of course, it is packaged in the cloak of marriage to make it seem virtuous. Here I am reminded of an argument that one of the pro-marriage commentators made on that video of the Distributist with the TFM. As it is a typical example, let's look at it. He said, "A lot of MGTOWs seem to be under the impression that all marriages are the same, all relationships are the same, and that any given marriage ends in a coin flip of divorce or not. Of course, this is not the case, as a man can select his partner wisely and mitigate his risk of divorce. In traditionalist communities, the rate of divorce is surely much lower than 50%. For active practicing Mormons, the rate is 15%, for example. I am not a Mormon, by the way, just giving an example. Not all marriages are created equal, and most people just do a poor job of selecting partners. And the self-sacrifice argument is valid because it is based on values that MGTOW people obviously don't have. Most people in some way believe life should not be just lived for the purpose of fulfilling one's own desire. As such, MGTOW people need to convince people to throw away their entire value system. Because even as I, for example, accept the broad trends of the sexual marketplace in modern society, I firmly reject MGTOW, and I'm willing to take the risks to self that marriage poses. Especially given that if I select a good partner with these same values, not the first woman that comes my way, the chances of a successful marriage are high. Of course, entering into a marriage with a woman who believes only in self-interest is going to be a bad idea, because successful marriages require sacrifice by their nature. However, the idea that all women, all humans, and all relationships are fundamentally solely self-interested is a fallacious modernist lie. The first paragraph just shows a misunderstanding of probability. To say that a given marriage has a coin flip chance of failure is not saying that all marriages have that same chance. Some have higher, some have lower. This is how averages are calculated. That does not change the fact that a given marriage has around the same chance. However, there is way worse odds than smoking. Of course, one can smoke responsibly and keep away most bad effects, but then one can choose to not smoke at all. The commentator makes it seem like he values sacrifice, unlike MGTOWs. It is hilarious because if he gets a wife, he is not benefiting anyone else directly. It is just that he values having a wife more than the risk. Either he is naive or adventurous. Different people have different risk appetites, but he is still doing it for his pleasure and happiness. He is not dying to save others. Calling it a sacrifice is as ridiculous as calling smoking sacrifice, if not worse. You do it because you like it, and any risk you ignore is not because of some sacrifice. That is the end. The whole issue arises because of one simple factor. Unless the dynamics of relationship are let to flower naturally to the bitter end, it will just be a power struggle without merit on either side.